Alright, I'm going to show you how to test your ignition system to see if you have a problem with your starter, problem with your battery, problem with your ignition switch, or possibly ignition key, or your neutral safety switch. This is a late 2002, early 2003 Toyota Corolla. My buddy here, my neighbor, good friend here, we're working on his car, and we already pulled the starter out and left it hooked up. The starter just dangling right there. That's not how it's supposed to look. And this is a starter for a Chevy V8. And what you would do is, on the Corolla, the starter is located between the engine block and the transmission, and it's bolted up. It's kind of hard to get to, so the only way to really video or record this is to pull the starter out so you can see it under the right conditions. And back here you'll see the wires that go into the Toyota Corolla starter. You've got the basic ground wire, which is that copper one right there with a nut on it that has no wiring going to it. It just goes into the solenoid. And then you have this right here, which is your constant hot. When the battery's hooked up, that's constantly hot. It's your, it's in charge of your fusible link. It's your main heavy battery cable that goes to your power terminal on your starter, on your solenoid, which is, let me see that right there, which is this one right here. It has a nut on it, and it has usually has a boot over it because it's constant power. So that's going to be your ground, I believe, but it has no wires going to it. That just goes into the block, into the solenoid. And that's your constant hot right there. It has your large battery cable with a large boot on it, and that goes to your battery. And then this is your ignition key right here that goes to your ignition switch. When you turn the ignition key over, that's what delivers power right here that charges the solenoid that starts your vehicle. So you pretty much have 3 bolts, or 3 wires, or 3 plugs, or whatever. You have 3 items of interest on all starters. One is your ignition wire, which is usually a small wire. One is a big heavy wire, which is your constant power that goes to your power terminal, your battery cable. And then one is your ground, or your electrode pole, whatever you want to call it, that you can run a ground to the block if you wanted to, I believe. So this right here is a Chevy V8 starter, and looking at the back here, this would be your ground. The only difference is on a Chevy, you have this stud that comes out that's copper electrode, and this is grounded inside the actual starter, because you have to have a way to give a constant ground from your solenoid to your starter. So you have this nut right here with this electrode coming out of a Chevy small block V8, and then you have these 2 plugs here. This one right here, the big nut, this is going to be your constant power, your main power source that goes direct to your battery, and this is going to be your ignition key that runs the little wire with a nut that goes in your ignition. And the easy way to test this is when you have the battery hooked up and the starter is still installed in the bottom of the Chevy truck. If you want to find out if it is your starter or possibly your solenoid that's going out one of these problems, it's pretty easy to do. All you have to do is, with your battery hooked up and everything going, you find a constant ground anywhere. This is a bad ground, but anything on the frame that is constantly metallic. And then you go over to your power and make sure your light works. As long as it works, then you have continuity, and you know that you have positive and negative, and your light bulb will light up on your tester light. So imagine this starter was under your Chevy V8 or Ford or whatever else. They all have 3 plugs. One is, like I said, the electrode, and the other 2 are the 2 that we're concerned with. This one here would have constant power to the battery, and this one here is for your starter switch. So ground out your negative side, and with this you're going to place it here, and this would have a wire connected to it, and then you'd turn the key. When you turn the ignition key, if your light lights up every time you turn the key, then you know your problem is in your starter and not with your electrical system or your neutral safety switch. If you put your power here with this hooked up to your vehicle, turn the key, and you get no light response, then you know you're not getting a signal from your ignition over to the starter, telling the starter to start. So there's nothing wrong with your starter. It's either going to be your neutral safety switch, or it's going to be your ignition system, your ignition switch. So right here, let me get this Chevy starter out of the way, if I can, without getting too horrifically dirty. It's got my camera in my hands. Okay, now I'm going to show you here what we did is I got the battery disconnected. There's a positive, the negative disconnected. It's hanging right there off the side. This is the starter right here to his car. And once I hook it up, I have to be careful because that's the constant hot terminal there. And then next to it is a little plug. Sometimes it's a little black or purple wire. It's kind of hard to see. That's the only reason why I got it up here. And what I'm going to do is hook up the power, disconnect the ignition wire, put the light in the ignition wire, ground the light to something that we know works as a ground, turn the key. If the tester light turns on, then we know for a fact that it's the ignition, the starter is bad. So, leave the thing hanging here. What I'm going to do here is first disconnect this. This is our ignition wire right here. On a Chevy, it would just be a wire with a nut. It wouldn't have a plug on it. I'm going to put this starter, hard to see here, in a position where it's not too vulnerable and where you can kind of see it. Now I want to make sure that that nut stays covered, or at least doesn't hit any metallic objects, or we're going to have a little spark going on here. So I'm just going to hold on to this starter, and the starter is fully hooked up. The only difference is it's not hooked up to the block, it's just laying on top of the block. And so here's my ignition wire right here. That can stay right there, that's not hitting any metal. Here's my ignition wire right here, and then what I'm going to do is go ahead and hook that up to a ground. And he's already hooked it up right there to a bolt, which is kind of hard to see, but that's just a fairing bolt that goes to the frame. Now go ahead and connect your negative cable. And now we're going to test the light. And we know right there that's a bad ground. So we're going to move that to another location right here. That'll work right there, because that should be going through the fairing. And then there we go. So we got the negative cable hooked up on the battery. We got that hooked up to a bolt. Now go ahead and test the light. We're hook up to positive. We know we have continuity. So now what we're going to do is he's going to shove this wire tester. Oh, it came off, so we're going to test it one more time just to make sure. You can barely clip it on as long as you're careful. Okay, so we know we got continuity. Now he's going to stab that into the ignition switch there. Go ahead and stab it real hard so it sticks. Okay, that's good right there. Isn't that the way it always works? Okay, so now that tester light has a good ground. Go ahead, TJ. And it's hooked up here to the solenoid, or whatever, the ignition switch. Now go ahead and bump it, and now it's turning on. So he's bumping it, bumping it, bumping it, bumping it, bumping it. So what that tells us right there is it is a starter problem, because we have power from the ignition to the starter, which means it cannot be a neutral safety switch, which means it cannot be an ignition switch. It is a power with the starter. So if you want to figure out, weed out some of your electrical problems to see if it is a neutral safety switch or if it is a ignition switch, then just do this little test. Leave your starter where it is, bolted in your car. Pull off the ignition coil wire here, the ignition wire. Put a tester light. Make sure you test it for continuity. Pump it over. And if the light turns on every time you turn the key, then you are getting power to your starter. It's not a starter. It's not a ignition switch or neutral safety. It's definitely a starter problem. Well, I hope that helps somebody. And this here is a 2003 Toyota Corolla.